Hello and welcome to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and I'm excited to share this very first episode with you all. And so the reason I started this podcast and why it's focusing on stories is because I love storytelling, and whether that's stories in television shows, or in movies, or novels, or plays, musicals, etc. I've just always loved stories ever since I was really young, always loved reading, always loved writing. And so now I'm blending that passion for writing and storytelling, I'm blending that now with podcasting. I love listening to podcasts. I have a number that I listen to each and every week. And then I finally decided I want to start one of my own. And so this is the subject I chose, storytelling. And what I'm going to do each week is occasionally I'll share a short story, like today I'm going to share one. Occasionally I will discuss my favorites in books, my favorite shows. Occasionally I'll have guests. I'd love to get listeners involved and get your writing prompts, that kind of stuff. But today I'm going to kick it off with a short story I wrote called Tale Reimagined. And I wrote this a few years ago. I recently rediscovered it on my computer. I kind of read it and made me laugh a little bit. Hopefully it'll do the same for you. So without further ado, it's story time. It had been a long, grueling, brutal battle, but at last he'd made it. He'd traveled long and far and vanquished many foes along the way. He'd defeated dragons and outsmarted evil merchants who had attempted to swindle him out of money and other valuables. He was not only the most handsome, charming, dashing prince in the land, but also the most clever. The cleverest? There was no challenge too challenging, no battle too difficult, no fight not worth fighting. It was all done in the name of love. His one true love, with whom he was destined to live happily ever after. "Never fear, my dear, sweet, unnamed princess. Your perfect Prince Charming awaits," he said heroically as he hopped off his mighty steed, who shook its flawless white mane and whinnied proudly. The prince turned his eyes to the castle, where the princess had been locked away for an indiscernible amount of time. Perhaps weeks, months, or even days. He crossed the wooden drawbridge, which was conveniently down, and entered the castle, which was conveniently unguarded and evidently abandoned, which had him wondering why there was such a huge, well-built, yet dreary-looking castle smack dab in the middle of nowhere, with no occupants save a long-lost princess who'd been locked up here since birth? Perhaps birth. What kind of awful parents did this to their child? He had no time to wonder as he ascended the swirling cement steps, all the while taking in his surroundings. An open, semicircle-shaped window poured light into the otherwise creepily dark room, which was bare, no furniture at all, only a filthy-looking red carpet and some metal candlesticks, but mysteriously with no candles. The place was in desperate need of serious redecorating. In fact, with some major renovation, this castle could make a great place to rent out to orphans and become a nice foster home, or perhaps it could be turned into a soup kitchen, or a brothel house, but he digressed. He'd climbed the steps all the way to the top room, the attic, of course, because where else would the princess be located? With a flourishing kick, the door flew open. He entered and looked around. Another plain, cold room with gray walls and no furniture, except for a canopy bed, draped with pink satin curtains for some inexplicable reason. The prince approached the bed and found himself holding his breath. He pushed aside the curtain to find the peaceful, sleeping form of the beautiful princess for the very first time. The breath left him in a quivering sigh, his heart aflutter as he took in her beauty. She had long, sweeping, golden locks and an effervescent, pale complexion. Her lips were parted ever so slightly, and her hands, dainty and delicate, were folded over her chest, which rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm. She wore a long lavender gown, and on her feet a pair of gold heels. How did she sleep in such gorgeous formal attire, he wondered. Brushing aside a stray lock of her silken hair, the prince gingerly caressed her soft, smooth cheek and leaned down, eyes shutting, lips puckering, inching closer and closer to her face, when she shrieked at the top of her lungs. The prince shrieked as well as the princess lunged at him, tackling him to the ground. Her screaming ceased, while his intensified as she pinned him on his back and thrust his hands above his head. "Who are you? Are you a rapist?" "No. What? No. I'm Prince Charming. I've come to rescue you." At that, the princess stopped, her expression calm, if not a little confused. Finally, she released him, and he brought his trembling hands to his chest, unable to stop himself from letting out a pathetic whimper, like a baby. "Rescue me," the princess said. She got up and hastily fixed her dress, smoothing down a wrinkle in the fabric and adjusting her sleeves. Meanwhile, the prince stayed on the ground, hands now balled in loose fists, as if ready to weakly defend himself, When she shot a look at him, he yelped and put his hands over his face. "Who sent you?" she asked. He blinked and peeked up at her again. She had her hands on her hips, but otherwise she no longer looked as frighteningly intimidating. At last he got to his feet, ready to explain himself. "I was sent by a noble official on behalf of the land," the prince said, a rather cryptic explanation, but it was all the information he had. "I was delivered a message stating that a princess had been locked away many moons ago and needed rescuing, and so here I am, your knight in shining armor." The princess raised a brow. "I thought you said you were a prince." The prince faltered. "I am." "Are you?" the princess asked. "Or are you a knight? Which is it?" The prince stared at her for a painfully long, tense moment. This was not going at all as he'd imagined. He needed to take back control of this heroic rescue. He could still prove himself to be the man of her dreams. They'd simply gotten off to the wrong foot was all. He could fix this. He extended his hand towards her. Though the gesture was only met by the princess's confused and perhaps unimpressed silence, he dropped his hand. "Okay, look," he said. "I realize this may seem odd, a complete stranger swooping in and attempting to wake you from your sleep by kissing you, but that doesn't mean we can't—" "Listen, buddy," the princess interrupted, jabbing a finger in his chest. "Let's get a few things clear. First and foremost, did it ever occur to you that maybe I don't want to be rescued?" The prince furrowed his brow. How could anyone not want to be rescued from such a dreary, aesthetically unappealing castle? "Secondly," the princess said, undeterred in her building rant, "in case you hadn't noticed, I'm the only one here. No humans or animals or mystical talking creatures. Thus, I'm in no physical danger, and in fact, I'll let you in on a little secret. I live here of my own free will." "You do?" the prince said, flabbergasted. "Certainly," the princess said. "Nobody locked me away here. I wasn't kidnapped. I didn't run away from home." She paused, and a smirk graced her lips. "I moved away." "But why?" the prince asked. "Why? Why not? That's why," the princess said. "I visit the town every so often and pay my dear, homely parents an obligatory visit, but frankly, this was the best option for all of us. I've got 2 younger sisters, you know, 2 ghoulish, obnoxious sisters. I can't be associated with them. They sing constantly. I needed to get away." "Hold on," the prince said. "If you live here of your own free will, why does this place look so dark and dreary and frighteningly disgusting?" the princess offered. "Well, yes," the prince said. At that, the princess let out a rich laugh, an overly exaggerated expression of unrestrained glee, almost maniacal with how loud and unhinged it was. It had the prince taking a step back, until she abruptly stopped and coughed into her hand. "I like it that way," she said, deadpan, which only confused and frightened the prince all the more. She seemed to sense his confusion, for she added, "Oh, don't get me wrong, it's not as if I do nothing but sleep all day. I have hobbies, you know. Come see." Now she took his hand, and her palm felt noticeably rough, not soft and smooth as he'd imagined. She led the way to another staircase behind a concealed door. Where did that door come from, he wondered. Somehow he knew better not to ask. Down they went, the prince's dread only rising, until they reached the bottom of the stairs, and the princess opened a door to a secluded chamber. The prince took it all in with a marveled look on his face, eyes lit up in curious wonder. The room was filled with brilliantly colored cloths, pinks and yellows and silvers and blues, along with spools of thread, needles, pins, and other sewing materials. A large sewing machine sat in the middle of the room, and shelves lined the walls, which were filled with hand-woven stuffed animals. "You made these all yourself?" the prince asked. "Yes, every one," the princess said in a boasting air. She released his hand and dashed over to her collection, holding one up, a tiger. "Oh, yes, you're a silly boy. Oh, and this is Ralph." She picked up a turtle. "Don't be fooled. He can outrace anybody, especially the hare." She picked up a purple rabbit. "Fifi, you sly little thing." She scooped up more of her stuffed animals, hugging them tightly and swinging them in her arms, lost in her own little world. The prince, meanwhile, was backing out of the room. "Well, it seems like you're perfectly happy here with your animal friends. I've clearly miscalculated this entire situation, so I'll best be on my way now." "Okay," the princess said, uncaring. "Feel free to come back any time you wish." "Oh, yeah, sure," the prince said, all but making a run for it. "Well, farewell, I suppose." "So long, Mr. Prince Charming," the princess said. She brought one of the stuffed animals up to her ear. A plump elephant. "What's that?" "Oh, Mr. Pipperton says goodbye and safe travels." "Thank you, Mr. Pipperson," the prince said. "Pipperton," the princess said, a flash of rage in her eyes. "Yes," the prince said. "My deepest apologies to him." "Oh," the princess said, immediately brightening. "It's quite all right. No harm done. Take care now." The prince dashed up the stairs, into her bedroom, down the first staircase, and finally out the door without once looking back. He breathed in the fresh air of the outdoors and let out a long sigh of relief. His horse stood nearby, grazing by the grass. He walked up and gently touched the horse's face, stroking his silky mane. "Well, it seems like I've made quite the terrible mistake," the prince said as he mounted the horse. "Turns out the princess isn't a damsel in distress, but rather a shut-in who talks to stuffed animals. I don't need that craziness in my life." He shuddered and shook his head, ready to rid himself of this whole experience. "Now then, let's go home and try on matching hats, horsey McCloppers." With that, the prince rode off into the sunset on his trusty horse, and he and the princess lived separately and magnificently ever after. Alright, so that was Fairy Tale Reimagined. Just kind of a silly little piece, but, hopefully you enjoyed it. I enjoyed writing it and reading it today. Kind of a parody of fairy tales, even though honestly I love fairy tales. It's just, just something to laugh at. And now, so ways to listen to Storytelling Saga. You can listen to Storytelling Saga on Apple Podcasts or podcast.com. You can also follow Storytelling Saga on Facebook or on Twitter. The Twitter handle is @StorytellSaga. And I only want to just say this once, I won't bring it up again, but the reason it's Storytell Saga and not Storytelling Saga for the Twitter handle is because I didn't realize actually that on Twitter there's a maximum amount of characters, 15. And so when I went to type in Storytelling Saga, unfortunately, it's 16 characters, so it cut off the A. So Storytelling Sag, that doesn't quite work, so Storytell Saga, it is what it is. But also, if you'd like to contact me, you can do so by leaving a message in the contact section at storytellingsaga.com, which is also where I'll be posting the links to the episodes each week. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts to storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I'll be sharing another short story I wrote. It's called The Light. A more serious tone. Hopefully you'll enjoy that one as well. But until next time, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.